Let's dive in, shall we? Let's waste no time. Biggest questions in the Big Ten this year. There are several ways that we could go here, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to hit some tips of icebergs, and believe me, we're going to dive in a whole lot more as the season draws closer here. But I want to start with Penn State. As I've told you, I've been pretty obsessed with Penn State. I think they are the most likely, if there's a non-conference champ to make the playoff, I think that's the team. And you could also ask how many teams we're going to have in the playoff this year, and my answer would be 3 question marks in a row. But my question, as it relates to Penn State, is this marriage of Kirk Ciarrocca, new offensive coordinator. If you've been out of pocket in the offseason, he comes in from Minnesota. They set a whole lot of records up there in Minnesota last year. So he's come in. So I've been getting a lot of questions about Penn State, and all the questions from my Nittany Lion fans are defense. And I just want to answer it like this. I did it on the Late Kick Extra podcast that we just released yesterday, and it's available for download wherever you get your podcasts. A lot of people were talking about Penn State's defense, and I said, I'm fine with that. Of course, you have some star power returning there. You got some guys to replace. Maybe you want to kick it up a notch production-wise, but let's not underestimate. LSU, perfect example. Let's not underestimate for a second what having a true top 5, even top 7, top 10 caliber offensive unit does for a defense. When they're on the bench, the kind of pressure that you're putting on the other side of that field to match what you're doing, it leads to a lot more risk-taking than a lot of folks in the Big Ten are comfortable with that you're facing on a week-in, week-out basis. And so you'll find, I think, defensively, all those tumblers kind of fall into place if you've got things figured out offensively. So I don't know what things look like right from the jump because, as is the case pretty much nationwide, we haven't really had time at Penn State to gel this new offensive coordinator, new concepts. How many new rocks are we turning over really here? We hadn't really had time to gel all that. So I don't know what it looks like right off the bat, but this is a season-long biggest questions. Season-long, how much juice can we squeeze out of this Kirk Ciarrocca marriage with the offense and the cast currently in place there at Penn State? I wanted to go to Michigan, too. These are 2 programs that we've spoken a whole lot about over specifically the past 3 months. And I'll look offense with Michigan, too. Now, this is one that's not that hard to figure out. We have described Michigan's future as Josh Gaddis or bust, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But I think a lot of the point-counterpoint here, those that are counterpointing our optimism about Michigan would say you're only as good as the pieces on your roster. And whether it be questions as to who's going to start at quarterback and whoever they start at quarterback, is he going to be good enough replacing pieces on the offensive line? Do you have enough firepower at the skill positions there? And when I say skill position, I'm talking about wide receiver. I don't really like even saying that. Everyone who's on the football field is skilled. However, here's how I'm going to look at Michigan this year. It's not that. Okay, you're going to have who you're going to have on your roster. And to a certain degree, Josh Gaddis is still in a situation going into year 2 where he's not responsible for a whole lot of what they have on that roster. To a certain degree, he's still using what he inherited. So everyone's going to set expectation levels. I just want to know if they're going to exceed expectations. Because even if they don't win their division this year, they don't win the Big Ten, even if they go 9-3 this year, if they're exceeding pretty reasonable expectation levels relative to what they currently have in the cupboard, that means if I'm a Michigan fan, when I get J.J. McCarthy on campus and I get receivers like the one I just landed out in California and hopefully others, when I start to get that infusion of talent on campus and I'm already developing a reputation as meeting or exceeding expectation level, well, when the expectation level goes up because my talent level has gone up, then it stands to reason we could contend, challenge for the Big Ten championship. We could contend and challenge for a playoff spot. So even if they don't do that this year, you're going to learn a whole lot about Michigan this year as it relates to how they perform compared to what you expect and what I expect from them. Let's go to Wisconsin. This quarterback situation, probably going to be Jack Cohn, known on this show as Jack Doan. Graham Mertz, lying in the weeds there. A lot of you up in Madison would love to see him get a crack at this job, but whoever's there, what we know, you don't have to be a Wisconsin Badger fan to know this, what we know is they've got some production to replace at running back. Now, they've got some very capable, probably stable running backs there, not just one individual capable of filling the shoes of a guy like Jonathan Taylor, for example, but they probably have a stable full of guys who can rush for 2,500 yards, 3,000 yards for all we know, if you need him to this year. Having said that, how do they take the next step at Wisconsin? And does it involve them making a concerted effort to stretch the field vertically a little bit more? Do they have to stretch the field vertically a little bit or even a lot more in order to replace that lost production? Because that production was really important for them, and that's what I care about, production. Now, at receiver, you got Davis, you got Pryor, probably question marks for those of us at a more national level beyond those two names. But the thing about it is, if you've got the right offense in place, you watch every single year, folks who have their offense figured out, folks who have their passing game figured out, every year, without fail, one or two wide receivers emerge that you didn't know about at the beginning of the season. And it's because offenses can make players. You're not on the roster if you don't have talent. So the talent's there. The right offenses can draw the most out of their roster and the talent on said roster. So let's see if they try and stretch the field more this year vertically at Wisconsin. And if they do, then maybe beyond the two names I mentioned at receiver, we start talking about someone else. And maybe, just maybe, and this is a pretty wild concept, I will grant you, but maybe, just maybe, if they evolve that offensive style a little bit more, then we get down the Big Ten conference stretch, and it looks like Wisconsin's going to the Big Ten championship game. And instead of looking at them as a nice test to get us ready for the playoff and to put a conference title crown on our head, maybe you look at them as someone you're actually worried about losing to. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case right now if you're, say, the Ohio State Buckeyes. We're going to get to Ohio State in just a second. But first, I want to mention a couple of teams here that were headed in wildly opposite directions last year. Minnesota. I mean, as good as it gets for Minnesota last year. And Purdue fell flat on their face. So I would like to know, with those two programs respectively, were those just aberrations or were those trends? I mean, does it not seem like all that long ago that Jeff Brom was thought of as one of the hottest coaching commodities in America? And when's the last time you heard the name Brom mentioned in any one of these head coaching openings? Now, Purdue folks don't want to hear this, but nationally, I don't know that his reputation didn't take a fairly significant hit last year. Now, there was a lot going on. I mean, the least of which was losing a guy like Rondell Moore, for example, a guy who was consensus All-American caliber, focal point of their offense. You lose him, you lose a whole lot. So you get him back. That alone is enough to change a lot of your fortune. But bigger picture, if they don't get things rectified this year, if they are not, again, a respectable program, it's not so much what I think about Purdue. It's, what am I thinking about Brom after this season? Now, on the flip side, the total flip side of that coin, if I look up at Minnesota and they're able to take, admittedly, a lot of the same pieces they won with last year being back again. Tanner Morgan is one. Rashad Bateman is another at wide receiver. If they're able to take those pieces and they're able to even come close to duplicating, again this year, the success they had last year, I want to stress again, at Minnesota, then obviously it's a huge deal for PJ Fleck, but also I would start thinking about Minnesota a lot the same way that I'm thinking about Iowa State right now. Here's what you worry about if you're a Minnesota fan. What you worry about is we want to do good, we want to win, but what if we win so good and we are so high performing that it comes at the expense of losing our head coach in the future? That's always going to be a concern. The higher you fly, then the more you get noticed, and the more you get noticed, your offensive coordinator got taken last year as a result of the insane amounts of success you had. What if that were to happen with PJ Fleck? They worry about that with Matt Campbell at Iowa State. Here's the point. If they don't leave, you got yourself a world-class head coach. But if they do leave, they're leaving your program by default in an infinitely better position than it was when they found it, which makes your program and your job more attractive to whoever the next hot coaching candidate is. And so you continue to elevate your program just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. That's something I really focus on with Minnesota this year. And lastly, with Ohio State, that's where it's all about defense to me. And it's not so much talent at all. It's not at all a talent issue there. You're going to hear the stat over and over again, how many guys they lost off their defense to the NFL draft. And it's noteworthy. I think the number's like 7 or 8, something like that. It's a noteworthy stat. Here's what you're not going to hear anyone who has a clue about Ohio State say. You're not going to hear anyone say, they lost all those guys and they just don't have the talent to replace them. Talent's not an issue with them. I'm not saying that they have someone the absolute equivalent of Chase Young or Jeff Okudah, but they are not hurting for talent there. But as we've seen with other big-time programs, like Alabama, for example, they've had these classes where they'd send a ton from the defensive side of the ball alone to the NFL draft. And since they've recruited at a top 3 level every year, Bama fans, or in this case, Ohio State fans, they could just rattle the names off. They can rattle the depth chart off. I'm not going to argue with you about talent. I'm not going to argue with you about people on that roster having enough talent from the neck down to get the job done, the likes of which you expect it to be done at. It's the neck up. It's the stuff that we can't quantify in a recruiting star rating. It's the stuff you can't quantify necessarily in off-season conditioning. It's stuff that you have to be in live bullets game action to find out about someone. The dog mentality that you have to play this game at the highest level, or at least you have to have some of those guys sprinkled about your units in order to play this game at the highest level. Who among us, including the most ardent Buckeye fans, who among us definitively knows what the mental and character makeup of that team is going to be? You don't. Brian Day doesn't know, and he's the head coach. It's a trick question. No one can know it yet. So if you watch Ohio State this year, for example, there's a chance that you're watching them just go scorched earth on the Big Ten, defense included, and you're saying, this is totally insane. They lost all these dudes, and they're performing at the exact same level. Or you could watch them, and they're going to be good regardless, but you could watch them, and you could say, they're beating these teams, but defensively, I don't know, they're just a step off from what they were last year, and it's not going to cost them maybe against Iowa or Indiana, but it may cost them down the road. You could easily see things going either way. So those are some of the biggest questions in the Big Ten. And again, we're going to get a whole lot more hyper-focused on individual teams, individual units, and talk about things on a more granular level as the season approaches. We just don't really have a lot to go on. I don't consider preview magazines as being a lot to go on. I consider feedback from on the ground, from people covering the team or being close to the team. That's tangible information that we like to go on. Spring was canceled. We didn't have any of that, so can't wait to get some of it.